I was 10 years old when Violet Mason disappeared from her bedroom. Her family lived 3 houses down from ours, and though I didn't know her well, I remember her as one of those kids who was always smiling, always kind. That night is burned into my memory, not because I was friends with Violet, but because I saw it happen. My father had given me an old pair of binoculars earlier that month, a hand-me-down gift from his own childhood. I had spent the last few weeks using them to look at the stars, though the city's light pollution made that difficult. Instead, I often found myself scanning the neighborhood out of boredom, watching stray cats skitter through yards or catching glimpses of neighbors leaving their porches after dark. That night, I was sitting by my window, the binoculars resting against my face, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, was moving toward the Mason house. It was hunched over, its arms impossibly long, dragging against the ground as it crept closer. The creature looked human, but its proportions were wrong, its movements unnatural. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It stopped outside Violet's window, crouching low as it pressed a massive hand against the glass. The pane shattered with a muted crack, and before I could fully process what I was seeing, the thing reached in and pulled Violet out. She thrashed and screamed, her voice cutting through the still night air, but it didn't seem to care. It moved with terrifying ease, disappearing into the woods at the edge of the neighborhood. I scrambled from my chair, shouting for my dad. When he burst into my room, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my words came out in frantic gasps. He calmed me enough to call the police, but when they arrived, I could see the skepticism in their faces. A tall, monstrous figure? Dragging a child through the woods? They chalked it up to the imagination of a scared kid and moved on, leaving Violet's parents to plead with the community for answers. For weeks, Violet's disappearance dominated the local news. Her smiling face was everywhere, on flyers, posters, even the sides of milk cartons. But no one could explain what had happened. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, when another girl named Erica was taken from her bedroom, that the community began to panic. By the end of that winter, 6 children had gone missing, all under eerily similar circumstances. Whispers began to circulate among the kids at school, fueled by fear and half-remembered stories. Some claimed they'd seen a shadowy figure lurking near their houses at night, others swore it was a ghost or some kind of urban legend come to life. But one thing was certain, the thing that was taking kids wasn't human. In the spring of that year, the police found the bodies. All 6 were discovered in the basement of an abandoned train depot at the edge of town. The children had been mutilated, their remains barely recognizable. The discovery shocked the community, and the search for a suspect intensified. Eventually, the police arrested a man named Henry Stark, a local recluse with a history of mental illness. Evidence was thin, but Stark's unusual height and odd behavior made him an easy scapegoat. He was convicted within months, and the case was officially closed. But I didn't believe it, not for a second. Henry Stark was tall, sure, but he was human. And the thing I saw that night wasn't. Life moved on, as it always does. My dad moved us to another neighborhood a year later, hoping to leave the memories of that dark time behind. My younger sister, Kara, struggled the most with the change. She had been close friends with one of the missing girls, and losing her had left a scar that no amount of therapy could heal. Kara stopped speaking to most people, retreating into her own world. It was like watching a light go out. As for me, the memories of that night never left me. I became obsessed with finding answers, spending every spare moment reading about cryptids, urban legends, and the paranormal. The kids at school started calling me Odd Eddie, mocking me for my fixation on ghosts and monsters. I didn't care. I needed to understand what I had seen. By the time I reached middle school, I had found a small circle of friends who shared my fascination, or at least tolerated it. There was Grace, who had lost her brother to the thing in the woods, and Max, a quiet kid who rarely spoke about his past but carried a heavy sadness in his eyes. The three of us became inseparable, spending our afternoons at the library or exploring the woods around town, searching for clues. One evening, as the three of us were walking home from the library, Max stopped suddenly, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Grace and I followed his gaze. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, just beyond the edge of a small grove of trees, I caught sight of it. A tall, shadowy figure was standing perfectly still, its outline barely visible in the fading light. My stomach twisted into knots. "It's just a tree," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Max shook his head. "No. It's watching us." Before I could say anything else, the figure moved. It dropped to all fours and began crawling toward us, its movements unnervingly fluid. Grace screamed, and we bolted, our feet pounding against the pavement as we ran toward the nearest house. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, the figure was gone. But the feeling of its eyes on me lingered long after we reached the safety of Grace's front porch. The three of us became obsessed. We spent every afternoon piecing together anything we could about the figure we'd seen. Grace swore it was the same thing that had taken her brother, and Max believed it was connected to a string of disappearances from decades ago, long before Violet Mason's time. Our research took us deep into the town's history. Hill Creek had always had an eerie reputation, with stories of strange lights in the woods and unexplained vanishings dating back to its founding. The library's archives were full of old newspaper clippings, each one hinting at something lurking in the shadows. Hunter goes missing near Ridgewood Forest, local woman reports tall man at edge of property, unsolved mystery haunts quiet town. But the most chilling find came from Grace. One afternoon, she unearthed an old journal belonging to a man named Caleb Porter, one of the town's earliest settlers. His entries spoke of a shadowy figure he called the Tall One, describing it as a creature that walks as a man but is not of this earth. He claimed it came at night, taking children from their beds and leaving no trace. One passage stood out to us. "The Tall One cannot enter unbidden. It watches, it waits. A crack in the window, a gap in the door, these are its invitations. Guard the thresholds, for once it is inside, it cannot be stopped." We read those words over and over, chills creeping down our spines. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but deep down, we knew this was the thing we were dealing with. The Tall One was real, and it was still here. As the weeks went on, my obsession grew. I started staying up late at night, watching the woods through my bedroom window with the same binoculars I'd used all those years ago. Most nights, there was nothing, just the dark silhouette of trees swaying gently in the wind. But one night, just after midnight, I saw something. It was faint at first, a flicker of movement near the tree line. I squinted through the binoculars, my heart racing as the shadow came into focus. It was the figure, tall and angular, its limbs too long and its movements unnaturally smooth. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Then, slowly, it turned toward me. I dropped the binoculars, my breath catching in my throat. I stumbled back from the window, the image of its hollow face burned into my mind. It had seen me. It knew I was watching. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I told Grace and Max what I'd seen. Grace's face went pale, and she clenched her hands into fists. "It's watching us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It knows we're looking for it." Max nodded, his expression grim. "We need to do something. If it's coming back, we can't just sit here." We spent the rest of the day coming up with a plan. Grace suggested setting up cameras around the woods, hoping to catch evidence of the creature. Max wanted to create traps, though we had no idea what would actually work against something like this. In the end, we settled on a mix of both, cameras to watch, and tripwires to slow it down if it tried to get too close. That evening, we set out into the woods with flashlights and supplies. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chorus of crickets and frogs replaced by an oppressive silence. Every step felt like a risk, the shadows between the trees stretching longer than they should have. We worked quickly, setting up cameras on sturdy branches and weaving thin wires between tree trunks. Max marked the tripwires with strips of fabric so we wouldn't trip over them ourselves, though I doubted they would do much to stop the tall one. Still, it felt better to do something, to fight back, even if it was futile. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My flashlight beam darted between the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. "We should head back," Grace said finally, her voice tight. "It's getting late." We agreed, though none of us said what we were really thinking. We didn't want to be in the woods after dark. The first night, the cameras caught nothing. The second night was the same. But on the third night, we found something. It was Max who noticed it first. He called us over to his house, his face pale as he played the footage on his computer. The camera pointed toward the tree line had captured a shadow moving between the trees. It was subtle, just a flicker at first, almost imperceptible, but as the footage played on, the shadow grew larger, closer. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The tall one stood in full view of the camera, its impossibly long arms hanging limply at its sides. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared at the camera, its hollow face tilting slightly. The footage ended abruptly, the screen cutting to static. None of us said a word, the silence in the room almost deafening. That night, I dreamed of Violet Mason. She was standing in the woods, her white nightgown torn and stained with dirt. Her eyes were wide, her face pale and expressionless. She didn't say anything, but I knew she was trying to warn me. When I woke up, I couldn't shake the image of her face. It lingered in my mind all day, a constant reminder of what we were up against. The tall one wasn't just watching us, it was coming for us. And we had no idea how footage felt like a slow unraveling. The image of the tall one standing motionless in the clearing haunted me, its hollow face and unnaturally still posture burned into my mind. We were no longer just chasing a story or trying to understand a mystery, we were being hunted. Grace became increasingly quiet, spending most of her time reading through old books and journals we had gathered. Max buried himself in planning, drawing up maps of the woods and marking the areas where we had seen or felt something unusual. As for me, I was restless. I couldn't stop watching the woods at night, waiting for the figure to reappear. It did. I was sitting by my window again, my binoculars perched on the sill, when I saw the movement. The tall one emerged from the tree line, its long limbs moving with that same unnerving fluidity. It stopped at the edge of the woods, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. For a moment, I thought it was looking directly at me, but then it turned toward my neighbor's house. My stomach dropped as I realized where it was heading, Grace's house. I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door, my heart pounding as I sprinted down the street. The cold night air stung my lungs, but I didn't care. Grace's bedroom light was on when I reached her house, and I threw rocks at her window until she appeared, her face pale and confused. "What are you doing?" she hissed, opening the window. "It's here," I gasped, pointing toward the woods. "I saw it heading this way." Her eyes widened, and without another word, she grabbed her flashlight and climbed down the trellis. Together, we crept to the edge of her backyard, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The woods were still, the air heavy with silence. And then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. It came from just beyond the tree line, and I felt my blood run cold. Grace grabbed my arm. "We need to go." But before we could move, the growl turned into a distorted laugh, the sound echoing through the trees. A shadow moved between the trunks, its long limbs brushing against the branches. I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been its face, and felt my legs turn to jelly. We ran, tripping over roots and crashing through the underbrush until we reached the safety of her house. Once inside, we locked every door and window, collapsing onto the floor in a heap. "We can't keep doing this," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. "It's playing with us." The next morning, we met Max at our usual spot in the library. His face was grim as he spread out a map of the woods on the table. "We need to figure out where it's coming from," he said, his finger tracing the areas where we'd set up cameras. "Every time we've seen it, it's been near the same part of the woods. There has to be a reason." Grace and I exchanged a look. The idea of going back into the woods terrified me, but Max was right. We needed answers. "I found something," Grace said, pulling out Caleb Porter's journal. She flipped to a page near the back, her finger landing on a passage that sent chills down my spine. "The tall one dwells where the trees grow thickest, where the earth is soft with rot. Its lair is marked by 3 stones, each bearing its mark. Those who enter seldom return." Max leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "If we can find these stones, maybe we can figure out how to stop it." "Or it stops us," I muttered, but they ignored me. That evening, we packed our gear, flashlights, cameras, and Max's crude tripwire traps, and set out into the woods. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge, but I forced myself to keep going. We reached the area marked on Max's map just as the last light of day faded. The woods were darker here, the canopy above so thick it blocked out the moonlight. The air smelled damp, and the ground was soft beneath our feet. After an hour of searching, Grace found the first stone. It was covered in moss, its surface etched with strange symbols that looked like scratches. We cleared away the dirt and leaves, revealing 2 more stones nearby, each bearing the same markings. "This is it," Max said, his voice hushed. "This is where it lives." We set up cameras around the clearing, positioning them to capture every angle. Max rigged his tripwires, the thin cords nearly invisible against the underbrush. Grace and I worked in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. As we finished, a sudden chill swept through the clearing. The air grew heavy, and the woods fell eerily silent. I glanced at Grace and Max, my heart pounding. "It knows we're here," Grace whispered. A low hum filled the air, faint at first but growing louder. It wasn't a sound I could describe, it was more like a vibration, a presence that filled my chest and made it hard to breathe. And then I saw it. The tall one emerged from the shadows, its long limbs brushing against the trees as it moved. It was larger than I remembered, its body impossibly thin yet somehow powerful. Its face, or the void where its face should have been, turned toward us, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Don't move," Max hissed, his voice barely audible. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting slightly. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it charged. We scattered, crashing through the woods as the creature's distorted laugh echoed behind us. The cameras and traps were forgotten as we ran, our only thought to get as far away as possible. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we realized we were lost. The woods were darker than ever, the trees pressing in around us like walls. "Where is it?" Grace whispered, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Before I could answer, a low growl rumbled from the shadows. The tall one was close, too close, reverberating through the dense forest. I gripped my flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached, the weak beam trembling as I swept it across the trees. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch, blurring the line between what was real and what wasn't. "We have to keep moving," Max whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Which way?" Grace's voice trembled, her flashlight beam darting wildly. "We're going in circles." Another growl echoed from behind us, closer this time. Without waiting for an answer, Max grabbed Grace's arm and started forward, his movements frantic. I followed, my legs feeling like lead with every step. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in on us from all sides. The three of us stumbled through the woods, our breathing ragged and shallow. The tall one's presence felt inescapable, its laughter, a distorted, unnatural sound, drifting through the air like smoke. It wasn't chasing us, not exactly. It was toying with us, herding us deeper into its territory. "We're trapped," Grace muttered, her voice cracking. "It's leading us somewhere." Max stopped suddenly, turning to face us. "Then we stop playing its game. If it's leading us, we turn back." I nodded, too scared to argue. But as we turned, the path behind us seemed to shift. Trees that hadn't been there before now blocked the way, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and the soft hum returned, louder and more oppressive. "This isn't possible," I whispered, my breath visible in the freezing air. "It's the stones," Max said, his face pale. "We're still in the clearing, we never left." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The stones weren't just markers, they were a trap, a boundary we couldn't cross. The tall one had us exactly where it wanted. "What do we do?" Grace asked, her voice shaking. Max didn't answer. He was staring at something behind us, his eyes wide with terror. Slowly, I turned. The tall one was standing at the edge of the clearing, its long arms hanging limply at its sides. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched us, its head tilting slightly as if curious. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like gravity itself had doubled. My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. Max was the first to move. He grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the figure, his voice breaking as he screamed, "Leave us alone." The rock sailed through the air and struck the tall one square in the chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the creature took a single step forward. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost methodical. Each step brought it closer, its impossibly long limbs brushing against the ground. Max backed away, his bravado fading as the creature closed the distance. "Run," he shouted, shoving Grace toward the edge of the clearing. We didn't need to be told twice. Grace and I bolted, our legs carrying us into the dark labyrinth of trees. Max stayed behind, his voice echoing through the woods as he screamed at the creature, buying us time. The forest felt endless. Every path we took seemed to loop back on itself, the same twisted trees and moss-covered rocks appearing again and again. Grace was crying, her flashlight beam shaking wildly as she stumbled beside me. "We can't leave him," she choked out. "We have to go back." "Grace, we don't," my words caught in my throat as the hum returned, louder than ever. It vibrated through my chest, making it hard to breathe. Ahead of us, the path split into two. One side led deeper into the darkness, while the other was bathed in a faint, eerie light. Grace hesitated, her eyes darting between the two paths. "This way," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the light. The path led us to a small clearing, its center dominated by an ancient oak tree. The air here felt different, calmer, almost sacred. Strange symbols were carved into the bark, glowing faintly in the moonlight. "This has to mean something," Grace said, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's a way to stop it." I didn't respond. My attention was drawn to the base of the tree, where a small pile of stones lay arranged in a perfect circle. The symbols on the bark seemed to pulse, their glow intensifying as the hum grew louder. "It's coming," Grace whispered, clutching my arm. The tall one stepped into the clearing, its shadow stretching across the ground. It didn't charge or lunge, it simply stood there, its hollow face fixed on us. The glow from the tree seemed to hold it at bay, but I could feel its rage, a palpable force that pressed against my skin. "We need to break the circle," Grace said suddenly, her voice urgent. "What?" I turned to her, panic rising. "Why?" "It's holding us here," she said, pointing to the stones. "If we break it, maybe we can escape." The idea terrified me, but she was right. The stones had kept us trapped, and the glow from the tree felt like our only chance. With shaking hands, I reached down and swept my foot through the circle, scattering the stones. The effect was immediate. The glow from the tree flared, blindingly bright, and the hum rose to a deafening pitch. The tall one let out a screech, a horrible, inhuman sound that echoed through the woods. It recoiled, its long limbs twitching violently as it stumbled back into the shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Grace and I ran, the forest finally opening up around us. When we emerged onto the street, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. We collapsed onto the curb, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with exhaustion. "Max," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He didn't make it." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, making it hard to think, hard to feel. The tall one was still out there. And I had a sinking feeling this felt like a blur. Grace and I stopped speaking to anyone, even each other. We barely left our houses, the fear that the tall one was still out there gnawing at the edges of our sanity. I spent hours by my window, staring at the woods, half expecting to see those long limbs moving between the trees. But it was Max's absence that haunted me the most. The guilt was unbearable. I replayed the moment we ran in my head over and over, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Grace wasn't handling it any better, her face was pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. 2 days after our escape, she showed up at my house unannounced, clutching Caleb Porter's journal. "We have to go back," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. I stared at her, stunned. "Are you insane? We barely made it out alive." "We owe it to Max," she said, her grip on the journal tightening. "And there's more. Look." She flipped to a page near the end, the ink faded but legible. "The tall one feeds on fear. It binds its victims, not with chains, but with their own terror. Only those who confront it can break free." Her eyes met mine. "If we don't face it, it'll never stop. It'll come for us, for more people. You know that." I didn't want to believe her. Every instinct told me to stay as far away from the woods as possible. But deep down, I knew she was right. The tall one wouldn't just disappear. It would keep hunting, keep taking. And Max deserved better than to be left behind. That evening, we returned to the woods. The sun was setting as we approached the tree line, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us like claws. Grace carried the journal, while I brought a flashlight and the one thing I thought might help, a pocket knife. It felt laughable against something like the tall one, but holding it gave me a sliver of courage. The woods were eerily quiet as we made our way back to the clearing. The path felt different, more twisted, as though the forest itself was trying to keep us out. But Grace moved with determination, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. When we reached the clearing, the ancient oak tree loomed before us, its bark glowing faintly in the moonlight. The pile of stones was gone, scattered across the ground. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. "It's here," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't have to wait long. The hum returned, low and oppressive, vibrating through the air. Shadows shifted at the edge of the clearing, and then the tall one emerged. It was bigger than before, its limbs impossibly long, its body casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the ground. It moved slowly, deliberately, its hollow face fixed on us. I felt my knees weaken, my breath catching in my throat. "Don't let it scare you," Grace said, her voice trembling. "That's what it wants." The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting slightly. For a moment, it just stood there, watching us. Then it raised one long arm and pointed directly at Grace. She froze, the journal slipping from her hands. "What do we do?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, searching for anything from the journal, from the stories we'd read. The Tall One feeds on fear. Confront it. But how could we confront something like this? Before I could act, the Tall One moved. It lunged forward, its long limbs brushing against the ground as it closed the distance between us. Grace screamed, stumbling backward as the creature loomed over her. "Get away from her!" I shouted, my voice breaking. Without thinking, I charged, the pocketknife clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't know what I was doing, what could a knife do against something like this, but I had to try. As I got closer, the hum grew louder, almost deafening. The Tall One turned its hollow face toward me, and for a moment, I thought it was smiling. I swung the knife, the blade catching the faint glow of the tree's light. It struck the creature's arm, and for the first time, it reacted. A horrible screech tore through the air as it recoiled, its long limbs flailing. "Grace, the tree!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Do something with the tree." She didn't hesitate. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed the journal and began reading aloud. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, their cadence strange and rhythmic. The symbols on the tree's bark began to glow brighter, their light pulsing in time with her voice. The Tall One let out another screech, its movements frantic as it thrashed against an invisible force. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. Grace's voice grew louder, more confident, as she continued reading. The light from the tree flared, blindingly bright, and the Tall One stumbled backward, its limbs contorting unnaturally. I could feel the fear it had once inflicted on us now radiating back toward it, its power weakening. With one final, piercing scream, the creature collapsed into the shadows, its body dissolving like smoke. The hum faded, and the woods fell silent. We stood there, gasping for breath, the light from the tree dimming until it was nothing but a faint glow. Grace dropped the journal, her hands shaking. "Is it gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. The clearing felt lighter, less oppressive, but the fear lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. The walk back to the street was quiet. Neither of us spoke, our footsteps the only sound in the still night. When we reached the edge of the woods, Grace turned to me, her expression solemn. "We can't tell anyone about this," she said. "They wouldn't believe us." I nodded. She was right. Who would believe that two kids had faced down a monster in the woods? That we had one? But as I looked back at the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The Tall One might be gone, for now, but the woods held secrets we could never hope to understand. We never saw the Tall One again, but its presence never truly left us. Grace moved away a year later, her family desperate to start over somewhere new. I stayed, watching the woods from my bedroom window every night, waiting for any sign of movement. Years passed, and life went on. But every now and then, I hear it, the faint hum, distant but familiar. And I know that somewhere, in some dark corner of the world, it's still watching. Waiting.